But, I guess the subject is what we really been talking about is emotions and expectations. And I think my brain is lately has shifted into, you know, expectations, a little bit more than emotions maybe at times, but expectations and stuff can stir up emotions. I think the two are connected. But I don't, like I said, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to try to validate with your therapist, to try to find companionship as far as, trying to have reach for agreement, or maybe you want your therapist to agree with you, or maybe you want to validate or whatever. I don't think that's necessarily completely wrong, depending on how your brain works. Some people are after that, and if they get the agreement, sometimes that gives them confidence, and that gives them, a boost of confidence, and that gives them, a boost of self-esteem. When they have somebody, when you make an argument, I think, and somebody agrees with you, because some of us, including myself, might have a hard time with criticism, or whatever. We just might. I mean, some of us do. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you have a hard time, getting criticism, or whatever, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. People can struggle with that as well. Like, don't criticize me, right? I win the argument, you don't, right? Or, and I think there's that type of personality, but I don't think that's completely wrong, right? And, for someone to be stuck up, or whatever you want to call it, stuck in their own opinion, stuck in their own ideology, stuck in their own belief system, and they won't give any wiggle room for the other side. That's not necessarily bad. I mean, people on some things feel extremely strong on some issues or some opinions or whatever, and they won't budge. But I think that has to do, I think that has to do with, I think some of that maybe have to do with our personality, our experience in life, how we view the world, but yeah, I know before I said, therapy shouldn't be about, validation, or it shouldn't be about agreement or disagreement. I'm not quite sure if that's correct either. I got to retract a little bit, about those things that I said, because I think with some people, they do want to win the argument. They do want to win, the ideology. They want to win, their opinion is, superior or valid. That's not like I said, that's not necessarily so bad. Because I think, we do reach out to each other to look for approval, but that's not bad. I mean, I think we do that probably when we're young kids. We want mom and dad to, or our guardians or our caretakers or whatever, we want them to, we want them to, we want them to agree with us. but we want them to be proud of us too. And we're looking for approval when we do that, which is normal, especially I think you know, at the very early brain stages of our lives that, we want approval. We're seeking approval. We want dad to be proud of us or mom to be proud of us or a teacher to be proud of us. That's healthy in my view. That's fine. To seek, I think, even to seek that out in your later years, adult years too. It's all about, what you think is working. And, I think that's, like I said, I think that's what really counts is what do you think, what do you think is working, right? And what do you think is not working, but like I said, I think that's good, to have a therapist that is non-judgmental, which in my opinion, Duncan is very non-judgmental. He doesn't judge. I don't like to judge, but I noticed that, that maybe I just haven't really hit that point very much about my opinion about how therapy is going, but I don't think he's a judger. He doesn't spend time judging me. I mean, I spend time, I think, doing self-judgment to my own self, yes. But I don't think he does. He's not, I don't think he's ever been like that, he's a listener, I think he's a good listener, but he's not saying stuff that I'm saying about myself when it comes to self-judgment, or whatever, Am I accusing myself of not being, authentic enough, or whatever? Duncan's not saying that though, right? I'm saying that. That's self-judgment, right? Too. So you got to be careful about that, or whatever. I think you got to be careful about that as well, because your therapist ain't saying that, or your counselor or your mentor or whoever you're working with. A lot of times they're not even judging you, they're not even caught up in conversation about judging you at all, which is healthy, that is good. I think people want to share, companionship and be non-judgmental or whatever. And I think that's good because like I said, we can be, like Daffy said, we can be our own worst enemy. And I think she's exactly right. I mean, I think we can be at times. We can be a wicked judge to our own self. We could be a wicked, we could have a wicked mind about our own self-image, and none of it's people, but other people don't see, people don't see that necessarily. Like I told Duncan, I says, who's accusing me of being a people pleaser? Nobody, right? Nobody. I mean, I live here in the complex. Nobody's saying that, right? That you're not being authentic enough or whatever. Nobody is. You just feel that way. You feel that way because I think that, again, I think it's about wanting power. I think a lot of us don't like I said, I've mentioned this before, we don't like rulers. We don't like it when we feel something has power over us, and that could be, we feel in our brain and we feel in our heart, that we're not authentic, we're not as authentic as we should be. But that's self-judgment, and my therapist has never accused me of that. So I think you do have to be careful, because self-judgment, I mean, like I said, can be very wicked too, and that's not good. I mean, if you're wicked, about judging yourself and stuff like that, that's not good, you know. So, um, but I do notice, though, I do notice that people, you know, when they share a narrative with you, or they share stories with you, and even I've done it in the past, you fake laugh about stuff that you were seriously hurt over, which is, I think, like I said, if you can point it out to somebody that, hey, it's not funny, you know. But I think we do that. There's this fake laugh, and there's this pretend laugh and this phony laugh or whatever when we got hurt, whatever we're talking about, you know. Um, and I notice that happens. It's just like, they laugh about it and everything, and it's like, no, it's not funny. It's not it's very serious, the experience that you had, you know. And so I think that's okay to point that out, in conversation, like, hey, it don't seem funny to me at all, you know. Um, and so, um, and so, um, like I said, that's, laughter is an emotion, and you have to ask yourself, well, is your laughter authentic, or, is it not, is it non-authentic? But maybe it's, like I said, maybe it's a way for people to cope. And that could very well be too, I mean, the fake laugh or whatever is a way for people to cope, a sarcastic laugh. And sometimes maybe it is. And I just don't even notice that in conversation, that when people are chuckling, or appears they're chuckling about some of their hurt or whatever, they're actually being sarcastic. And that could very well be too. But, maybe they deserve to be sarcastic about their experience, because it was, sometimes it was a really horrible, bad experience. And so some people express themselves that way with sarcasm, you know. So, I like I said, I think you do have to be careful of self-judgment. But, it depends on what your therapist and you decide to work on, what you're, I mean, you can go over your goals and say, okay, is this really what is this really what I want to do? And so, and I think Duncan asked me my goals, which I think is okay, but perhaps, Duncan can, he can decide a goal for me as well. Like, we talk about what, 4 or 5 goals of mine. Well, he could fill in the blank. Why not? Right? I mean, he can point out something that, that you're either good at or whatever, or you think that you're bad at, or you need improvement on. But I think therapists can do that. Just throw it in there for the heck of it, right? Let a therapist pick a goal for you. Because like I said, you're picking, 3 or 4 out. Have him pick at least 1 goal out. That what Duncan's goal is for you. That's not so bad, right? That's not such a bad deal, because sometimes that can be a great way to look at yourself and say, geez, you know, am I good or bad at it, or whatever. But then I think, be careful of that, because I don't know who defines what bad is or what good is, about yourself, but I don't see anything wrong with that. Let your mentor or your therapist or whoever you're working with pick out a goal for you, whether it's right or wrong, don't even worry about it, maybe, you know, but just, I think you gotta, be creative and, think creatively too. And, but like I said, I think it's true. We can be our own worst enemy, our own worst critic, our worst, um, our worst judge, right? On our own life, on our own mind. And like I said, that's not necessarily a good thing, because like I said, the object and the objective is, I think, to gain self-esteem, to gain self-confidence, and to, feel inspired, and feel, proud, and to feel proud of yourself and love yourself. I think that's what is really important. That I would say that's what really counts, but I mean, some people, like I said, depending on what is happening in their life, it might be hard to come by, though. Self-esteem and stuff like that might be hard to come by. I don't know what they're going through. So you got to be careful, about that. It's, people say, well, but there is, like I said, there's really, really bad judgment that can evolve in the community and about ourselves. Both can be really bad judgment towards our own, towards ourselves. So then you have two fights, really. You have a community that's judging you badly, and you have your own self judging you badly. That's bad. Then you do feel like there's no way out. I think probably at times. And that's not healthy. I mean, I think, good self-esteem, is, I think, what we're trying to gain. But like I said, it may be extremely hard to come by, depending on, what you are going through in life, but, Alexa, what does healthy self-esteem do to the human brain?
From betterhelp.com. Maintaining a balanced level of self-esteem is important for mental health, as it helps you navigate relationships and life challenges more effectively.
Absolutely. Right. But like I said, it's not necessarily, even self-esteem is not necessarily just naturally, given to you. So sometimes you have to try, harder to obtain it for whatever reason, because you're going through a lot of stress. So self-esteem, like I said, it might not readily be available. You might have to even fight for that at times in your life, you know. Um, but I agree with Alex. I think it's, um, I think that, um, I think that, uh, that self-esteem is very important. Self-confidence is very important. But like I said, a bully can really ruin that. They can cause a lot of damage, you know. They can really cause, for some people, a lot of damage, you know? Um, so, especially if they're making fun of your performance, they're making fun of you, they're making fun of your behavior, they're making fun of your intelligence. That all is a downer. That is really, that is, like I said, it's a downer, it's intimidating, and it causes a lot of discomfort when I think that happens to you. And like I said, I think that happened back there in Rockwell City, but I think, like I said, I think a lot of it, you know, went to shrugging it off. A lot of it went suppressed. Um, a lot of it was, ignored. And like I said, you don't want to do that, because perhaps then it does get worse, you know? And then people think that it's okay to do that. They think it's okay to, you know, make fun of someone else, and it's never okay. There's a problem there. I mean, how often do you hear people say, "Oh, I can take it." People can laugh at me and my performance, and I can take that. No problem. How often do you really hear that? Not very much. You know, and even if you do hear that from somebody, you really have to question it. Are they just trying to act tough? Are they just trying to put on a front? You know, are they just trying to, act like, they, a big shot or whatever? That's what you have to question, even if they say that. I'm not saying, but I think it's rare, you know, or whatever. I think for someone to say, I think for someone to say that. Um, and like I said, I think psychologists, and I think the studies or the research shows that, bully, what a bully can do to your brain is bad, 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 bad stuff. And like I said, it can really, especially, like I said, if it's a group of people who are making fun, not just one person making fun of your behavior, but a whole group of people. Like I said, that's extreme, right? You got a group of people, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people laughing at you. That's intimidating. That's, that can really level, that can really, really damage, I think, a person psychologically. Absolutely. So, um, so, I think, good sportsmanship, is, you know, like I said, I think good sportsmanship is not laughing at somebody. That's bad sportsmanship, right? You may be a good athlete, you may have a lot of skill, but your sportsmanship is shit. It's crap, you know, especially if you're bullying somebody and making fun of them or whatever. It's like, your sportsmanship is shit, you know? Like I said, and that, like I said, that sometimes, and I believe too, sportsmanship out trumps, I think should out trump, I should say, your skills, your abilities, your athleticism. You know, if you're going to be a piss poor, have, piss poor, hurtful sportsmanship, then, your athleticism, what does it mean then? You can be good at something all day long, but if your sportsmanship stinks, and you're just a bully and you're making fun of other people's performance and stuff like that. That's bad, you know. That's bad stuff. So um I think there's, like I said, I think there's times where, you know, you look back, but a lot of it stems from 12th grade on down, you know. I just, you know, I took speech in college. How many times? Nobody laughed at me, right? I mean, nobody did that. Like, I gave speech at a Boise State, I gave speeches at University of Iowa, right? Nobody laughed at me. Nobody made fun of my performance, right? Like Rockwell City did. It just didn't occur. You know, it just wasn't there, which I'm grateful for. You know, and I think that I feel good about that. It just goes to show that, you know, they didn't know what, I mean, if they did make fun of my performance, they didn't know what they were talking about. You know, they didn't even know, you know, they didn't know what they were doing, and, you know, or whatever. They, you know, they're making fun of you or whatever doesn't really amount to shit, you know, because you went on to college and you went on to work at jobs. And I don't remember a whole, you know, too many people making fun of me like Rockwell City did, you know. I just I don't remember it. You know, like I said, I think there was times where, you know, you know, or whatever. It's like, you know, you know, you don't have to put up with that, you know. Um, you know, I mean, if you feel uncomfortable with something, it's good to vent it. It's good to it's good to vent. It's good to express, you know, in your journal about it, and, you know, and I think that's what I continue to do. So, um, but but like I said, good healthy self confidence and self esteem, I think, is really what's great, good stuff for the brain and the human mind, you know. And you got to see what's going on, you know, with teachers and students and parents and family and friends and strangers. You got to observe what's going on, you know. And like I said, if they're, you know, they're going to bring you down, then, you know, they don't really understand too much. They don't really know you then. You know, they don't really understand much about you then, you know. So, but but like I said, I think shrugging it off, you know, and pretending, you know, that it doesn't hurt was, I think, to some degree, was common for me, you know, 12th grade on down, to do that. But like I said, I think that only hurt the situation even more, you know, because like I said, if you know, they did it once, some people think they can do it again. Three, four, five, six, seven, 8 times, they can hurt you, bully you, and get away with it, you know, until one day they can't do it anymore, you know. And it's just like that YouTube girl said about, you know, they'll leave, you know, because they realize that they can't get you anymore, you know. They can't bully you anymore. They can't succeed at it anymore. They're a failure. They they can't make it anymore. And sooner or later, that's what they're going to feel, you know, that they won't be able to do it. They'll just be, you know, it'll be a complete loss, you know, when they try to, right, when they try to keep you in that bully zone or whatever, where they think they, uh, you know, or whatever that they think, they're going to lose bad. And like I said, they'll have nowhere to go but to look at their own life and to look at their own brain. There'll be no, they'll be led to that eventually. They'll be led to that road, and they like I said, but if they're doing that bullying, then they deserve it. I think, I mean, if they're doing it, then I think sometimes they probably deserve it. But I got to be careful. Yeah, they do. I think at times there is something called punishment, and you do punish because people, especially if they've gotten away with it too much, it's like, hey, you got away with it too much. You made fun of me too much. I remember you, you laughed at me or whatever, so, you did it too much. It was enough for me to remember, I guess, it was enough to remember that it was in my mind, or it stayed in my mind, or whatever. So, but, it does come out, I think, in therapy about the past, about the present, and about how to deal with the future, but I think that's healthy in a way, though. I mean, if stuff comes out in therapy, sometimes, maybe you're just not ready for it, but it comes out anyhow. I think that's still good. And, I still think that's healthy, and like I said, if you're angry, sometimes that's okay too. If you're very angry, about something in therapy, and you have a lot of anger or whatever, that's not necessarily bad either, because that, your emotions, like Duncan and I talked about, that makes you aware of what is hurting you and what is not, hurting you. And so don't get caught up, I think, in trying to have someone govern your emotions, or having your own self govern your, something over your emotions. Like, don't self-judgment, like I said, that gets in the way. Ooh, I'm too angry in therapy. Or I'm too this in therapy. I'm too that in therapy. Right? That's where you got to be careful. Right? Because like I said, that's just self-judgment. And a lot of times we're the only ones saying it. Nobody else is. Right? Nobody else is saying it. And therefore, you got to be careful about that, or whatever. So those emotions are there for a reason. And I mean, why, right? Why do we say to ourselves, ooh, I got to be less angry, or I got to cry less, or I got to be less embarrassed, right? Well, who's saying that though? The person you're working with, or your own self, right? Because those are natural, right, and innate emotions that, that we have, right? So, we don't need to be, ashamed of our own biology. That's what I'm saying. I mean, that doesn't even make sense. In a way, it's like, how can you be ashamed of your own biology? Right? Because emotions are biology. They are in fact biology. But like I said, you got to train your mind, or, you got to look at something new maybe sometimes to say, hey, my emotions are just fine. I express them. They're healthy. Maybe I don't like to be embarrassed, right? And maybe I don't like to feel guilt or shame, right? Or sadness, but look, I'm going to express it and not be ashamed of it. And I think that's what the ideology of some of social emotional learning is about, is not to be afraid of expressing these emotions, right? And seven of them, I think scientists say that, that there's seven, but there's, many as over 20. And so you don't need to be ashamed of it, right? Who's teaching that? That, you need to be more of this or less of that, right? Who's saying that? Like I said, sometimes they're just, who's ever saying it to you can be completely wrong. They don't know, they don't hang out with you enough to know. Like I said, they just want, they just want, they just want sometimes, they just want, maybe they want, maybe if they want something out of your life or whatever, they just want something. And like I said, they just want to benefit. And they're not interested in you at all. They're not interested in you. Like I said, people will be, they will fake an interest in you to get their way. And that's just the harsh reality, I think, of life. They will fake it. They will fake it. They will pretend. They will do anything, they got to do to get to get their benefit and to get their way. And they'll just use you. They'll just use your life. And like I said, they're not interested in you at all. And like I said, there's some harsh reality out there. And I think, and yes, it is harsh, but you have to be, I think, honest and truthful to yourself. It's like, hey, you're attracted to a lot of people, but that doesn't mean, right, that they feel the same way about you, and, they, like I said, they don't think, they might not think, when it comes to physical attraction, they might not think anything like you, or whatever. So, but people will lie, or they'll pretend, they'll fake it, right? Just to get the benefit from you and use you. And they'll use you, and that's what people do. They'll just use you. And they don't, like I said, they don't deserve to use you like that. They don't deserve it because they don't spend no time with you. What makes you think you're deserving of my time or whatever, or you deserve something from me, right? When you don't spend any time with me, or whatever. It's like people have got to question that. They've got to be skeptical. It's like, well, I wonder if this person is using me. Well, do they spend any time with you? Do they take an interest in you? Are they adamant about taking an interest to you? Are they calling you? Are they visiting you? Or whatever. And if they're not, I think you should be extremely skeptical about motive, about maybe a motive that they have, or whatever. You should be skeptical, And so they just, like I said, they just want something maybe out of you. And that, like I said, once they get it out of you, you'll never see them again, They'll get the benefit from you and on they go, and like I said, they'll just use you. And so it's not worth, like, that's hurtful too, That, I mean, I think being genuine, like I said, is there's something about being genuine, I think, that is really meaningful, you know, and, you know, and so sometimes you do have to realize that there's physical attraction, but it's not, it's going to turn in maybe to fantasy, or whatever. But people, they don't think like you or whatever, but, it's okay. I mean, if it's fantasy, it's fantasy, but like I said, you can get hurt too, though. You can get hurt, too, by hanging around people you are physically attracted to. And, like I said, if they're going to hurt you with it, then you don't really want to be around them. You don't really want to communicate with them, because like I said, if you're physically attracted to them, they become very powerful, and they become extremely powerful to hurt your feelings. They can become extremely powerful to help you, but they can also become extremely powerful to hurt you, because you are, by your own biology, you are attracted to them, and there is, I think, physical attraction that is biological, and you are attracted to whoever you're attracted to. And that's just natural, normal, or whatever, and you don't need to be ashamed of it. It's when people, right, you find them attractive and, like I said, they say something, about that physical attraction to hurt you, that's bad. That will, like I said, that will really make it powerful, and damaging, to your brain. So like I said, sometimes the reality is, it's not about that physical attraction. Our minds want it to be about that. I think that's the problem. But socially, we don't connect. I think it's like, hey, there's biology. I'm attracted to you, but socially, I feel like I feel awkward around you. I feel like, you have too much power. You come off as kind of a bully at times. That, like I said, that can really do harm. So, so sometimes it's just, the reality is that you need a connection rather than just physical attraction. You need more of a connection than that in your life. You need more than that. But I think biology, though, says that is normal, it's fine, and it's authentic or whatever, and it's a biological right to be attracted to whoever you are, whoever it is, but so so it's just, like I said, I think healthy connections is, I think, what's important. I mean, yes, we, but like I said, I think too, though, the physical attraction, like I said, if you don't get everything you want out of physical attraction, right? I mean, okay, if you don't, like I said, you may get the physical attraction from somebody and that's it. You really don't get anything more from them than that. You're just attracted to them for whatever reason. You find them cute, you find them adorable, you find them attractive, right? You find him handsome, but maybe that's all, that's it. Like I said, I'm not sure about, right, about the connection, other than that. It's just, it's left at, right, it's left at the biological nature. But when you get into nurture with that person, something don't work. Like I said, they become way too powerful. They become, to your brain, they become, and you're really, like I said, with that physical attraction, you're really, you're really dwelling on what they say to you. And anything they say to you, like I said, could be extremely powerful. And that powerful, though, ends up hurting you rather than helping you. Unless you can get an understanding with them. Unless you can get, you can get a solid understanding of the way you feel. That's okay. And they're going to help you with it. That's okay. But it's not okay, right, if they're going to go the other way. And, they're going to laugh it up in your face, or they're going to call you gay, or, or they're going to call you a name or whatever. That's bad. Like I said, then, like I said, I think sometimes they ruin it then. If they're going to make fun of you or whatever, they ruin it. So it is tricky, I will say. Physical attraction is tricky, and it can be tricky. I think it can be extremely tricky. But if you get the physical attraction out of it, that's not such a bad deal. Maybe you don't get the social life with that person, but you do get the physical attraction from them. That's okay in my view. It's like, they are a gift then. They are a biological gift to you, but socially, like I said, it's just, for whatever reason, it may be really hard to connect, because, like I said, they're just, maybe they're just not into what you're into, and, let's face it, we do become bored, and, we do become bored, but because all of us have different interests, it's like, I like rocking chairs, but the other person, in your life, maybe that is surrounding you, don't like rock. I mean, they're not into rocking chairs, they don't really care if they have one or not, they don't, they're not into it, and like I said, the problem with school is they try to force you to be interested in something, like the core courses, right? Math, science, English, reading, right? They try to force you to be interested in it. And it's too hard. Some people are just completely bored with some of those subjects. And the school, like I said, puts an enormous pressure on you to try to take an interest, right, in one of those subjects. And you're bored with it. You don't have much of a desire. You don't have much of an interest, and you have hardly any motivation to keep learning about it over and over again. And it seems the more, and it just, like I said, it just doesn't, but that to me is normal. That is completely normal response to school, right? It's just like, hey, there's no interest, but you don't, like I said, a teacher doesn't need to punish you for that. They don't need to, you don't need to feel punished because you're not interested. If you're not interested, you're not interested. I mean, people, like I said, they don't need their energy sucked, right, into something, sucked out into something they're not really that interested in, you know? They know it's just, it's too hard, especially if people, are trying to find what they're interested, what they find interesting, or what they're interested in, you know. They don't want to be sucked, right, for 2-3 hours of their day. They don't want to be sucked dry of something that they just don't, like I said, they don't have much of an interest in. It's like football, I like the press conferences, I think, but, I'm not sure what other things maybe I like about the sport, I mean, I think the press conferences like Stacy, kind of introduced me to is fine. But, but I don't, like I said, I don't know. Or I do know. I think it's just, well, I think you got to be yourself, and, they like what they like, you like what you like. And like I said, I think, some people, like I said, I think like I was telling Duncan too, it's like, I think sometimes I find it hard to find a connection, but like I said, you're into the chat rooms, and some people just could care less about a chat room, I mean, they could care less about it. They have no interest in it whatsoever. Well, you do, obviously, so, someone doesn't want to go to a chat room for 3 or 4 hours and just be their energy sucked dry, because they have no interest in it whatsoever. It's boring to them, so, but it's something to think about. I think it's, look at yourself, and if like I said, it's a full-time job sometimes, just to, to dress, to eat, to sleep, right? It's a full-time job, and so if you're independent, through life, then some of it's completely understandable. It's like, well, for me, it's, it's a lot of work, to do some, to do stuff or whatever, and everybody's on a different wavelength sometimes, it's like you can't, like I said, it's hard to match energy levels, somebody's energy that you talk to can be way up and yours can be way down, and, what do you think's going to happen? It's like, so that's the, like I said, that's the expectation, I think, in school, is they want you to feel energized about a subject. And it's just like, you don't, though. You just don't have interest. And like I said, does that bring about, the so-called attention disorder? Maybe it does, and some people are fine with that label. But maybe, like I said, maybe that's the problem, though, is there's too much pressure on people's brains to take an interest in something when they don't have, they have zilch and Zippo, interest in that. It's just, it's too hard to do. It's very hard to do. So, and people, like I said, I think, we do seek arousals, and we do seek interest. I think we do seek arousal. We want to be aroused because, because being aroused is what, I think, is what is how to combat depression, right? And people want to feel that. They want to feel energized. They want to feel aroused. They want to feel, interested or whatever. But that's a great way to, to combat depression, you know? And so that, that's okay. And that's healthy in my view. It's just, um, so, but like I said, if you feel, being independent is not necessarily, like I said, depending on what you're going through in life, like I said, it's a full-time job for some people, like I said, to dress, to eat, to, to, to try to make time to their appointment and stuff like that. It's a full-time job, let alone, some people work 8 hours labor, tough labor, hard labor, right? Sweat labor, with some people that have jobs, they sweat, for 8 hours, just to bring home, a paycheck that allows them to eat or whatever. So, there's people who work really, really hard, but some people have anxiety and paranoia, and, it's hard for them to, go an 8-hour day, something can happen to our minds that changes stuff, changes basically our brain chemistry. We can have an experience in life and later in life maybe, and it's like, man, I feel nothing like I used to, right? Well, why is that? Because you had an experience. You had a, a gut, or, a hard experience at some point. And the brain chemistry, right, switched, to something else. And now maybe you struggle with, you got to take medication or whatever, but for the longest time, right, maybe you weren't that way, and, but that's what's so devastating about our brain chemistry, is that things can change over time, and like I said, your threshold of being scared, your threshold of being petrified, your threshold of being nervous, and your threshold of having anxiety and paranoia can be highly sensitive, depending on what you've experienced in life.